Well, hello everybody. I'm Dr. Ron Martinez, and welcome to the start of our course, which I'm really very much looking forward to. So today we're introducing the course, and specifically I want to look at what may be some potential barriers to success in academic publishing, and there are many of them, but we can deal with those. And also, what are we going to be looking at in today's course? Just quickly, a little bit about me. I've been involved in the field of applied linguistics since 1992, especially in the area of teacher development and supporting international scholars in their writing. And a lot of my work is uh, heavily flavored with vocabulary development and with something called corpus linguistics, which is essentially the use of electronic tools to analyze text, which can come in very handy for what you will be doing in this course. And so we'll be looking a little bit about using those tools also for you, and hopefully you'll find some of that useful. I am faculty both here at UC Berkeley, UC Berkeley's College Writing Program, and also a member of faculty at the Universidade Federal do Paraná, the Federal University of Paraná in Curitiba, Brazil, uh, where I'm also the director of a writing program, a writing center that supports international scholars or rather Brazilian scholars for international publication. And so I'm very much involved in both supporting authors, native speaking authors, but also international authors for whom English is not a first language. I'm also a member of the English Language Specialist Program for the United States Department of State, which occasionally sends me on missions to support the internationalization efforts of universities, especially outside the United States. And a couple of those initiatives, in my case, involve one, English as a medium of instruction, so how to help develop professors in different parts of the world so that they can deliver their courses through English, but also, and I would say more recently, especially, how to develop writing programs in universities that can support scholars in their internationalization or of their research, or how to disseminate their research more broadly on the global stage. So that's a little bit about me. It's enough about me. I want to know more about you. Specifically, I'm wondering why you're here, which might seem a bit of an odd question, considering that you are enrolled in this course, and you should know, I should know at least as your instructor, that you're here because you want to learn about international publication. But specifically, I mean, that's an obvious answer, but also I want to know why you're really here. And what I mean by that is what drives you to be here today? Or more broadly, what has driven you, or what do you think drives you to want to publish in the first place? What is your main motivation? And in reflecting on this question, what drives not only you, but a lot of publishers or a lot of scholars to want to publish, you can look back you can look at two aspects of that answer, which I think one of which is that there's a practical, pragmatic answer, which is, okay, I need to publish because I will not be able to get tenure, or I will not be able to get the best grants and so on without publications in top tier journals. That is a reality for a lot of us. However, I think that there is another motivation that's perhaps more important, and I'll be talking about that in a second. Um, but both have to do with acceptance, perhaps. On one level, on a more sort of superficial level, we want acceptance of our manuscripts. We want uh, a particular chapter or article to be accepted by a journal or a publisher. Perhaps more deeply, we want acceptance of not just one manuscript, but acceptance by our peers. We want acceptance of our ideas. In either case, uh, it has taken you, I'm sure, a number of hoops to get to this point where you want to publish. And I'd like you to reflect we're going to reflect now about those hoops that you had to go through, these barriers that you had to go through, and how certain fears can contribute negatively to your productivity as a writer. So take a little trip back in time before you were before you got into college, your first undergraduate program. I'm sure that you felt some anxiety of wondering if you were going to get in. This is a kind of your first, maybe your first real fear of rejection prior to getting into college. Your first fear, your major event of fear of rejection in higher education. And of course, then you overcome that fear and you get accepted into whatever university you're accepted into, and that's great. You think you're over that, no more problems, you're out, you graduate, and then you want to get into your MA or PhD program, probably one that you're involved in right now. And then there are the gatekeepers. The gatekeepers in this case are the individual institutions and the universities. These guys here are the gatekeepers, and they are kind of scary. And this can be a very scary experience for people. But then you overcome that only after you overcome a fear of rejection. But for a lot of people, this fear of rejection, of again getting into an MA program or PhD program, may be enough for them to not even try. They may feel that, oh, I may not. The fear of not being accepted is so traumatizing for them that they prefer not even to try, or they fear rejection of getting rejected by their top tier journal choice, their flagship journal of their field, and so they go for something that maybe they feel has a higher chance of not rejecting them. But then, of course, those of you who are taking this course, most of you are in, and that's great. You're happy. Of course, now you have one more barrier in front of you. A lot of you have not published before, and the gatekeepers now are these guys over here, Taylor and Francis and Springer and Wiley and Elsevier, of course, and others. And it's a scary thing now because not only are those guys gatekeeping, but you have a whole gauntlet of editors and reviewers who are ready just to beat up your ideas. And at the end of the day, this fear of rejection can be very daunting for many scholars who may really associate the process of publishing with just horrible negative ideas. And this is actually quite common. It's normal to feel this kind of fear of rejection. But in the end, what you're fearing is not so much perhaps of not getting a manuscript accepted. That is true as well, but that you have something that you say that you believe is important. Often cases, it's um, it's related to uh, work that you've done as a graduate student, either a master's student or a doctoral student. Um, you've dedicated several years of your life to, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and to have your ideas not accepted is just something that a lot of people um, fear, and that's normal. It's that's you're talking about something that's very precious to you. You're something that has formed part of your identity. So acceptance on a broader, on a deeper level is not acceptance just of a manuscript. That's important too for you, but acceptance of who you are, your ideas, and what you have to contribute to your field, to your discipline. You have something that you feel you want to say. That's something that you feel is worth saying, and you have a particular audience that you want to speak to. And this notion of having a particular audience that you want to address is something that we'll also talk about during this course. And this drives you to be the opportunity to be able to speak to your peers. And yes, you want people to know your name. And that's also a driver. You want people to recognize you. You know, they want people to cite you. And that's good because you believe in your ideas and you want other people to believe them as well. More and more, um, and of relevance to especially you who are taking this course, who is not a native speaker of English, uh, it's of relevance to know that you certainly do know that communication in science, publication, scientific publication, academic publication occurs these days mostly through English. And English can seem like this all-consuming, hegemonic monolith that is destroying all other languages in the world. And there are some arguments to be made that would suggest that that is the case because 95% of scientific communication these days occurs through English. But it's not just the fact that it's English language. There's a whole game, let's say, that's played, um, and a kind of hegemonic game that's played um, between publishers and authors that uh, is not just in English, but it involves preferences that stem from North America and Europe, and also of relevance to this course is that if your first language is not English, it may be a barrier to publication and a danger to think that English is somehow a magic catalyst to getting published. English is inescapable these days. In in Brazil, you have uh, English as a preferred language of even Brazilian journals since 2014 or even before. And I'm sure that if you are um, taking this course in from another country, you may find that in your country it's a similar experience. And so English is obviously the language of scientific communication for many disciplines, um, but you have to be careful to think that somehow if you have a really good English in your manuscript, that bippity boppity boo, uh, magically your manuscript is transformed into something that is citable and will cause impact. One thing doesn't necessarily entail the other. I'm going to talk a little bit about this now. So in the map of the world, if you were to um, change the proportions of each landmass in accordance with how much they publish relative to the rest of the world, this map would become contorted and look more like this. And the shape that this takes would, at a glance, seem to suggest that there are certain countries that that dominate certain regions. Quite plainly, the global north versus the global south stands out, and that certainly is true. Certainly, that is something that does occur. Here you see that um, Africa has shrunk to basically nothing. South America is quite diminished. And therefore, there are some that would say, well, here you have maybe some kind of correlation between um, English, since over here English is spoken and over here is English is spoken, or is very important in Scandinavia and the UK, for example, that it would seem that there is some kind of correlation perhaps between English. And indeed there is, but it goes beyond that. So if you look at the financial contribution investment in terms of billions of dollars uh, as a percentage of contribution to research and development. You have um, you have some numbers that stick out here. So you have, for example, very small contribution relative to the world from Africa and Central America and South America, for example, just 2.6%, 1%, and so on. But if you compare that, you have North America, that's 27.9%, Europe, 21.6%, and a huge chunk over here in East and Southeast Asia of a whopping 37.6%. And then you go back to that map and you see that actually there's more going on here. And specifically, you have over here on the right another big chunk that's nothing to do with English per se, since it's not the main or dominant language of Japan or China, for example, and yet it does grow, it becomes inflated. And then you see there's some kind of overlap that's not just English, but it's to do with other mechanisms as well. And so it's not just language, but also something to do with access to research networks. It's access to uh, resources, even reference resources, but also labs and so on, and that can make a difference. So we it's important to consider language um, as not some kind of magic bullet, but as something that is part of a melee, a part of a a part of an array of factors that can contribute to publication. And I put this in here as an example. So you have in 2020 an article that's been cited nearly 1,000 times. Um, this is 1,000 times in May of 2020, and uh, and it just came out in March of 2020. And so you think, wow, that's something that's really quite an accomplishment to have so many citations in such a short period of time. But what contributed to that is not the fact that it's in English. That's one part of it, but it had a lot to do with it being mentioned in the media, obviously with the backdrop of the global pandemic of 2020, that hydroxychloroquine was something that was discussed a lot in the media and promoted by the United States president and Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, and important news personalities like Laura Ingraham of Fox News. And so this article, which had a team of authors from France for whom English is not a first language. They published through English, yes, that was important. That helped to get the article noticed, perhaps, because if it had been written in another language, maybe it wouldn't have been noticed as much. But it was all these tweets by investors who mentioned this as a possible treatment, and um, important, prominent personalities in the business and science world tweeting about it, and then the president himself tweeting about it, even citing the journal in which that study appears, and on the news. And so, yes, English made a difference, but it was a lot more than that. An analog to this would be making appearances at conferences and being invited to speak and perhaps even blogging about it and getting mentioned by others. And a lot of that is facilitated by being plugged into a network of scholars and academic community that eventually becomes interested in your work and wants to cite it. English per se doesn't necessarily lead to a high impact or causing impact. In fact, research research actually shows that somewhere in the region of 50% of all articles written in English are actually never cited. Um, so it's not the fact that they're written in English that leads to their publication necessarily, or leading them to eventually being noticed. Uh, it's actually quite sad that you think that around half of all articles actually don't get noticed by anybody. And so it's not just English. All right. So there's something deeper going on here, and I do want to address nonetheless, even though English is just a tip of a large publication iceberg. I do want to address this apprehension that people have, um, and uh, Highland talks about it, and he mentions that Ken Highland. He mentions that attitude surveys reveal that English as an additional language authors often believe editors and referees are prejudiced against them for any non-standard language uses. Okay, so a key word here is often believe, and this belief that these editors and journals and referees are biased against authors, I think, is one of the barriers. It can be a potential or contribute to a barrier to writing, because if you come into the publication process with this belief that uh, because of deficient language you may not succeed, that is not a good way to attribute success or failure. In fact, as you'll see in a few minutes, um, later on in this module, there are other factors involved, and if you attribute success or failure to language alone, um, that's not very productive, because if you believe that an article is being criticized or even rejected due to language, you're not addressing any other possible shortcomings in your research, or even in your writing, that need to be addressed. So that is a key word here. This belief is something that's important. And so I like to look at, okay, that's a belief, but what evidence is there of that? I am sympathetic. I want to believe that in them, and I do believe that there is some bias. But um, what evidence is there of the kind of prejudice that Hyland mentions? Well, this is a debate that goes back some numbers since at least the 1990s. But one debate that stands out for me is the one that was touched off by John Flowerdew of the University of Hong Kong, at the time University of Leeds, who used Goffman's stigma as a theoretical framework to discuss this problem, with the idea that um, once a reviewer perceives that an author is not from a center country, so the main producers of research, especially the English-speaking producers of the world, then that author immediately has a stigma attached to her or his research. And I think what John Flowerdew says is a good example of this kind of argumentation, because he says, while it is difficult to find concrete evidence that writers who use English as an additional language are discriminated against in academic publishing, there is a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that they may be. So this is a very heavily hedged statement, that they may be, and it's difficult to find any concrete evidence, but there's anecdotal evidence. And those of you in the science world, especially not the humanities or social sciences, may be thinking, well, what good is anecdotal evidence? And I hate to be flippant or dismissive of Flowerdew's work, but because he was unable, or his research was not supported by a lot of empirical data to back up this notion that the authors were stigmatized, then he did touch off quite a debate in the literature. And so his inability to provide a lot of direct evidence that there's discrimination doesn't mean there isn't any discrimination or bias against English as an additional language authors. But there's a reason why evidence is hard to come by, and it's that, as you'll see in this module, language per se, language alone, never seems to be, or very, very rarely seems to be, the one thing that leads to a rejection. Um, is there evidence, though, for a bias, a native speaker bias, native speaker of English bias? Well, that we do have evidence for. And I know this as a director of a writing center, looking at manuscripts from so many different authors. And when their manuscripts are criticized, often this word, native speaker, this term native speaker, comes up. What you see is a general pattern of uh, kind of content-related commentary when manuscripts come back from journals for the authors to either rewrite or to correct or whatever. Um, Often the comments come back from reviewers with content-related uh, comments and also language-related comments, if the actually for both native and non-native speakers. And what happens is that non-native speakers tend to, focus on this native speaker term and think, okay, and they focus on that a little bit too much, that thinking that, okay, I have to fix the English in my manuscript, and not focusing enough, perhaps, on other elements in the manuscript. Whereas native speakers don't really think about the language as much; they focus more on the content areas. However, irrespective of whether or not native speakers are mentioned, I am personally against this idea that somehow native speakers should be asked to, or authors should be asked to look to seek out native speakers to redress language issues in their manuscripts, since uh, it's as if the implication is that any native speaker will do. You can grab some random person on the street at your local Starbucks and say, "Excuse me, are you a native speaker? Good. Can you look at my manuscript?" And of course, uh, that just is not the case. And it also somehow suggests that non-native speakers need native speakers to solve their problems, and I don't believe that to be the case either. Okay, so you do see this a lot. And as a matter of fact, if you look carefully at reviewers' comments, you often find that it is likely a non-native speaker, her or himself, who is actually recommending seeking out a native speaker. So this is a kind of very odd phrasing. It is valid to make an English writing review, with obviously mistakes here, since we are not English native speakers. And uh, we uh, they're often, at least in my experience, the harshest comments about language can come from apparently non-native speaking reviewers. Um, Again, you see native speaker here, but what's important to point out is that there's one section here, language and structure, but there's all this other stuff over here about content. And so on. Uh, Again, comment about native speaker, but also comments about a lot of other issues. So you can say that there is a bias, in the sense that there is this uh, for some reason this preference for native speakers to review manuscripts. Uh, but does that cause rejection? Does the fact that a reviewer notices that there are mistakes, or that the language doesn't sound like what a native speaker would produce, or whatever, does that recommendation to seek out a native speaker, does that necessarily lead to rejection? And that's another matter altogether. And so Martin Hewings looked at this He looked at 228 reviews from the Journal of English for Academic Purposes between 1998 and 2004. And these reviews were conducted by 56 different reviewers. There wasn't much information about who was doing the reviewing, but there's 56 different reviewers. And then Martin Hewings organized these manuscripts into type of author, so native and non-native, and then looked at how many of these manuscripts from each author type were accepted, um, rejected, or asked to revise and resubmit. Okay, and here you have the results of what his analysis was. And the question is there evidence of prejudice here? On the face of it, it would look like there is, because here you have on the left-hand side you have native, on the right-hand side you have the non-natives. In this category, A, it's A is accept, and here you see that the native speakers have 27% of their manuscripts were accepted versus 10% of the non-natives. I don't know about the statistical significance of this, but then in B, you have rejections, and then you have a higher rate of rejection among the non-native speakers. Oh, I'm sorry, B is revise and resubmit, so you have a higher number of manuscripts that were asked among non-native speakers to be worked on and then resubmitted. And then in category C, the last one, you have apparently far higher percentage of non-native speakers who were rejected. But when Martin Hewings analyzed the reasons for rejection, he found some very interesting things. So he said that first of all, it was not always possible to decide whether a comment was referring to language or content. So there was a mix, as we saw in the earlier examples, of language and content issues. So as an example, a reviewer might say, well, it's not clear what you mean by this. It's not, in that sense, that statement, it is not clear what the author means by this or that, could ostensibly refer to a conceptual element, something to do with the content per se, or a language element. Maybe the author is not being clear in the way that the author is expressing her or himself, or both. And then the second comment that Martin Hewing makes, is while the number of comments on language for non-native English-speaking authored papers is higher, so number of language-related comments was higher. Native English-speaking authors appeared to attract more criticism. That's interesting. And then his final statement, I think, is very relevant, which is there is no clear evidence that non-native English-speaking authors are disadvantaged relative to native English-speaking authors because they do not have English as a first language. Instead, he points out that of the 25 reviews that gave a reason to reject, 6 or 24% explicitly stated that the papers offered nothing new or of interest to the readership, and a further 3 said the papers reported work that was outside the field of ESP. So here you have, on the one hand, of the 25 reviews for the non-native speakers, 24% said that there wasn't clear, or there was nothing new to the readership, that was not made clear what was the novel about the paper. And that was a high percentage. And then 12% said that that they actually had sent the paper to the wrong journal. It wasn't appropriate for the journal. And those two statements are actually consistent with other research and my own experience talking to editors about the reasons for rejection. Not to do with language per se, but to do with a lack of clear novelty of the research, and basically not being within the the, the purview of the journal. On the other hand, Martin Hewings found that in the corresponding 15 reviews of the native authored papers, so British, American, Australian, and so on, only two said that they offered nothing new or of interest, and none claimed that they were not ESP related. And so there's something else going on here, um, at least in the research that Martin Hewings conducted, that lies outside English. Um, there's something else happening here. There's a question that needs to be asked: is why did these non-native English-speaking authors not um, explicitly state, rather, did not make explicit what was novel about their paper, and why did they apparently more frequently submit manuscripts that were not of relevance or outside the field of the journal, which is English for specific purposes, ESP. I think there are a number of reasons for that. We won't go into that right now, but for the purposes of this course, what his final conclusion is: whatever the reasons, they appear to lie outside any difficulties authors may have had in producing written English. And so the barriers to publication for these authors was not English per se; it was something else. And we'll be dealing with these something elses in this course, right? Part of it is that there is a kind of game, which I alluded to earlier in this module, that is played by authors and journal editors, and it's that there are certain rules of engagement, as it were, when it comes to writing and submitting papers that often uh, our authors are not trained in. These rules of engagement, the rules of this game, are often made explicit to authors in certain regions, and maybe not so much in others. And so Ken Highland, in 2016, he writes that this is basically the idea that there is linguistic injustice is a myth. I think this statement is not really it's it's not really the best way to word his thesis. It's not that linguistic injustice is a myth, but rather it is a misinterpretation of the phenomenon of rejection of non-native speaking authors vis-a-vis native speaking authors of English, since the attributing rejection to language alone is actually doing these authors an injustice. And Hyland says as much. He says, look, I am not, of course, claiming peer review to be perfect. There is, however, little evidence to support the idea that there is a widespread and systematic bias against writers whose first language is not English. Right. And he points to other evidence, Hyland, and it says that if you look at in the year 2000, you look at these 6 disciplines and their top tier journals, and you break them down and look at the first authors of those articles, and you look at native English speaking authors versus English as an additional language authors, you can see that in many cases, except for physics and electrical engineering, in most cases, you have native English speaking authors as having a higher percentage of representation, with an overall higher proportion of 61%. But in 2011, down here, that changes, and you have an increase in nearly all cases over here of authorship, if you look compared to the column above that, this in 2011. And overall, this changes completely to shift over to a higher proportion of non-native speaking authors in 2011, and this has increased since 2011. So you'll see that uh, in 2020 and 2021, this will have changed, and that's good news. So you're seeing more and more non-native speaking authors being represented in science, publishing more. There are many reasons for that. It's not necessarily the fact that they're learning English more, but it probably has something more to do with more access to research networks, um, and things of that nature, a kind of general upper mobility on the international academic in the academic stage more than English per se. But to Highland's point, this evidence would suggest that there isn't a systematic bias against them. In fact, there is evidence now that it's become more equitable. And important point I'll make now and I'll make again is that there are no native academic writers. You're not born knowing how to write academically. You could argue that there are people who are born poets, though I'm not sure that's really the case either, or born lyricists. You don't necessarily have to learn that formally, but um, the academic genre, and especially the research article genre, is one that is a convention that doesn't come natural to anybody. Um, and for me, it's something that I learned, but I have an advantage. I had maybe an advantage over many authors. I've always enjoyed writing. So here's a stretch of text that I wrote for a manuscript recently, and a chapter. And I point out here that there was something here I was not comfortable with in this text here. An official course number was attributed to the course. I didn't like this repetition, chorus and chorus here. I thought it sounded awkward. And I changed it to an official course number was assigned. And to me, that sounded much more elegant. Seems like a really simple thing, and it is, except that I police myself a lot when I'm writing. While I write, I'm reading it out to myself. I'm imagining what this will sound like to the reader. After I finish writing a paragraph or the whole text, I go back and I look at what I've written again and again to try to polish it. That's because I take a lot of pride in my writing. I like the writing process. I'm an experienced writer and I enjoy writing. That's not the case for a lot of you, not a case for probably the majority of writers, rather academic authors out there, ones who feel that they have to write for their career. They may not enjoy the process as much as I do. They may not take as much pride in their writing as I do. Um, but I like to think of academic authorship as a kind of craft that needs to be honed. It's not something that you're born with. It's something that takes time. And I consider myself a kind of artisan when it comes to writing as a whole. I enjoy writing, and hopefully one day, if you don't already, you will also see writing as something that is a craft, something that you hone, um, a kind of artisanal process. You'll see the Sullivan paper again in the next module. But Sullivan conducted some research in 2002 to look at why manuscripts are rejected by journals, or one particular journal in this case. And as you can see here, again, the number one reason was the manuscript was sent to the wrong journal, as Martin Hewing's research also suggests. A lack of novelty, number two, and then a number of other things. And then at the end, the number 10, Sullivan points out that poor writing is mentioned as a reason for rejection. But it's the clarification of this point that I find interesting for this particular moment in the module, which is he says, in talking about poor writing, he also talks about good writing. He says that good writing is like art. You know it when you see it, but describing what it makes it good is difficult. A quality paper states its purpose clearly, explains the importance of the topic, describes what happened, and reports the outcome. Such a paper is easy to read, the author's train of thought can be followed, and your questions are answered before you think to ask them. So let me stop right there for a second, because I think this is worth breaking down. First of all, uh, this idea that good writing is an art. Yes, of course, a lot of people think of poetry as a kind of art, but very few people, I think about the kind of prose that goes into an article on mathematics as art. But what he points out is that it's like art, like any art. You know it when you see it, but describing what makes it good can be difficult. But he tries, and he says, well, a quality paper, first of all, states its purpose clearly and explains the importance of the topic. And as we saw a little bit earlier in the Martin Hewing's research, the reasons for rejection, was that the reviewers were unable to see why the topic was important. And stating a purpose clearly and making it clear what the importance of the topic um, is one uh, rhetorical move that we're going to be talking a lot about. We'll be focusing on in this course because it is so important. A good writing is easy to read. This doesn't necessarily mean that the English is correct, but there's something else going on. And what he goes on and he explains this and says that the author's train of thought can be followed. And so this is also something that will be this notion of how to make your text more fluid and coherent and cohesive is important. How to make your train of thought more easily followed. And then this one here, this last point in the sentence, I think is wonderful, that your questions are answered before you think to ask them. So you, the reader, you're already raising questions, and you probably already do this with manuscripts and other literature that you read. You may be in questioning what the author is talking about, and then the author actually addresses your question before you even think to ask it. And good writers do this. Good writers, as they're writing, they're anticipating possible questions that the readers will have and already addresses them. And we'll be talking about how to do this in practice in this course as well. Then he goes on and says, well, um, on the other hand, uh, manuscripts that lack clarity and are poorly organized are rejected out of hand. Grammatical and spelling errors or incorrect punctuation uh, in themselves may not be reasons for rejection, but contribute to the decision if there are other weaknesses. So those things in themselves, um, I think this is really the main point, may contribute in themselves will not contribute to rejection, but maybe uh, or may not, rather I should say, are grammatical and spelling errors or language mistakes in English or imperfect or non-native English in and of itself is probably not the reason for rejection in most cases. But if there are other fragilities, if there are other shortcomings in a manuscript, it may tip the scales. And I think at the end of the day, that's probably what happens. So if you can hone and sculpt a manuscript, not thinking of uh, grammar necessarily or lexical choices alone, but the general shape of your text, the general shape that your article will take, that can make a big contribution. If you can see yourself as a kind of sculptor or an artisan in this way, I think it's a positive metaphor than than thinking of just language alone. And this is actually this artisanal idea, this idea of a writer as an artisan, an academic writer, is one that Helen Sword has talked about in a book called Air and Light and Time and Space, How Successful Academics Write. What Helen Sword wanted to know was, or understand better, what drives successful academics, and how do successful academics write? And by successful academics, she means academics that produce um, and sufficiently in their own view. So if you're an academic, do you publish in the volume that you feel is satisfactory to your field and to your needs? And do you have a good work-life balance? And do you feel that, are you happy about how much you write and how you write? And so successful academics, those that produce enough that they feel comfortable and happy with their writing, she found that there were certain things that they had in common, certain attributes, certain habits, and we'll talk about these now. So she interviewed 100 of these successful academic authors, and what she found was that among them, these habits stood out, and she called this a base, and forming behavioral habits, artisanal habits, social habits, and emotional habits. And by behavioral habits, what Helen Sword means is those habits which involve if you set aside time for writing or how often you write. In other words, what uh, uh, what is your behavior vis-a-vis your own writing? Do you do it every weekend? Do you uh, do you tend to have a special space for your writing, and so on? And I'm going to give you a chance to look at this and try analyzing yourself through a kind of questionnaire, um, whether what sort of habits you espouse of these. So she found that Helen Sword found that these successful academics have particular behavioral habits that contribute positively to their perception as being successful writers. And the social habits are those related to do you write by yourself, or do you write with others, or do you show your writing to others? Do you socialize your writing? The emotional habits are those related to um, how do you feel about your own writing? Is it something that scares you, or do you think that you're a good writer? And those are all sort of concrete habits that the authors were able to talk about. But she also found this artisanal habit, and by artisanal habits, Helen Sword is talking about more sort of metaphorically. To what extent do you, as an author, see your writing as a kind of art that you take pride in, and that you want to constantly sculpt and mold and improve, and that you take pride in? And so it's not just about if you set aside time for writing, or if you share your writing with others, write in the company of others, or write uh, with others in other ways, or if you feel good about your writing, which are all things that she identified as being important, but also to what extent do you see your writing as a kind of craft? And I hope that at least by the end of this course, you have a better awareness of this, that nobody is born an academic writer, but you can hone your writing and and shape it into the way you like. And one of the things that we'll be working on in this course is what are some shapes that writing can take of an academic article, a research article? What are some shapes that it can take? And so if you have an idea of how it should shape up, then you can hone your craft some more. Um, and and hopefully, if you don't already, even take pride in what you write. Because it is very common, and this is a barrier to academic writing, is that all writers, including academic writers, can go through this kind of negative feedback loop of I'm not good enough, I can't write, I'm a failure, I should give up writing, they hate me, they, I guess in this case being my peers, and and then maybe procrastinate. And that big P word, procrastinate, is a death knell for academic writers because everybody feels pressured to write their research in a timely way, and if you find excuses not to, then nobody ends up being happy. It's a lose-lose. You don't get your research out there, and the research world, your peers don't get to see your ideas. And so I want to talk about this for a moment, going back to these habits, these artisanal habits, and emotional habits, especially now, because even though kind of emotional habits can seem like something that isn't a practical uh, consideration when it comes to writing, in practice it actually is. As Helen Sword notes in that book, the Air and Time and Space book, these behavioral and artisanal and social and emotional habits form a kind of base, and this base kind of can look like the foundation of a house. And she calls this a writing house. Every writer should build a writing house with more or less equal heights of in these pillars. And if one is much stronger, or rather, I should say, if one is very small relative to the others, then obviously your roof can just kind of crash in on your head. And so, if this emotional pillar, for example, is really, really small, then obviously the roof can tilt and cause problems. And everybody's house can look different. Here you can have a stately home that is perhaps the home of a successful academic. Maybe this one academic who just likes to write on her or his own. But the point is that you, in the beginning of your academic writing career, your home you may feel is kind of incomplete. You're still building it, and that's fine. But just be aware that the same kind of fear of rejection that you had when you got into your MA or PhD program, you're going to have it now as you head out into the academic publishing world with all the added pressures to publish. You need to be aware of these base ideas, behavioral, the artisanal, the social, and the emotional, um, to that the social aspect of writing is actually one that we'll be talking about in this course. Is very important as well to realize, to know that you are not alone, that you are going through the same kind of challenges that not only inexperienced writers are going through, but also experienced ones. We are going through. I go through it now, even when I publish these days. The same kind of difficulties, maybe for different reasons, at a different level, but we all go through it, and it's important to talk about um, these things and to have other people look at your writing as well. And solitude then is not a good thing; it is a barrier to publication. In addition to these negative feelings that I mentioned, the self-doubt, um, not only thinking all whether or not you're publishing in English or not doesn't matter. I think everybody in grad school goes through this self-doubt, wondering, is my research any good? Do I really know what I'm doing? Will anybody really care about what I write? And you add on to this the idea that you don't know if your academic peers will in the people your readers will like your ideas, and then add on top of that the idea that, oh, I'm a non-native speaker of English, which many, if not all of you are, um, can really be a negative barrier to publication. So you have that, and then the added notion of, okay, uh, they're going to find me out. I'm an imposter, and this imposter syndrome is something that's it's real, and it's something that's important to realize that we all go through. This idea that maybe I'm going to be found out as not a real scientist or real academic, um, and this is doubly the case if your first language is not English, because um, this imposterhood, in this case, Eva Burnett's talking about imposterhood as being feelings of inadequacy, personal inauthenticity or fraudulence, self-doubt, low self-efficacy beliefs, and sometimes generalized anxiety. This imposterhood is something that many, if not all, people in grad school go through. Um, but it's even stronger if your first language is not English, because you may feel this imposterhood as an imposter in the English language. And so it's important to talk about these things, and be aware that you're not the only one. And research shows that simply discussing and realizing that you're not the only one feeling this way can help combat imposterhood. In fact, I'm going to ask you to look at a video about combating imposter syndrome, because I think it is so worth. It's a very short video; it's less than 5 minutes. It is really so worth thinking about. Um, in a book that I'll be referencing again, and you'll have some readings from this book, just writing for publication. The authors Yolonko and Saracho um, illustrate some of these negative feelings and how they can cause problems. And they cite um, lack of control and chaos and confusion, disorientation, feeling overwhelmed or swamped, rambling, digressing, drifting, fear, worry, anxiety, turmoil, getting stuck, feeling helpless, all of these things, which can be exacerbated by the imposter syndrome that I mentioned. All these things are very common feelings for academic writers to have. And what's at the center of all this is this avoidance and procrastination and disappointment. And as I said, this big P word, procrastination, is a real problem. And being aware of the foils, being aware of what can cause this to happen, is important. And we've discussed some of these things today. And it is important, therefore, to not think of the English language itself as being a barrier, because if you do, then it's just one big negative feeling that you'll have, and another big reason to procrastinate. And if I haven't already, by the end of this course, I hope you see that the English language per se, correctness alone, is not something that you need to think about as being a reason that you'll be rejected. So what are we going to work on in this course? Well, um, as I talked about when I opened this module, we want to work on your voice, not just grammar and vocabulary, but how can you make your voice stand out in your paper in a clear, convincing way? We're going to look beyond surface issues of language and look at the bigger picture. Because when one writes, an experienced author writes, a successful author, it's kind of like this image here in a car. Here you have to imagine that you're inside a car and you're looking at the road ahead of you. At the same time, you have to have an awareness of what's in the road behind you in the rear view mirror. And when I write, this is what I do. And I'm able to do this obviously when I drive, but when I write as well, throughout the writing process, which is I'm thinking about where I'm going with my discourse, where I'm going with my writing, but I'm also looking at where I've already taken the reader. what the reader also already knows, what I've stated clearly, the path that I've led the reader down already. And this is happening simultaneously as I write. And what happens for non-native speakers is they tend to look only at not even the road ahead, but just the road right under their wheels, um, because they're focusing so much on getting the language right. And this is a barrier because um, this guiding the reader, this that was a feature of good writing, as Sullivan pointed out and I mentioned earlier, helping the reader follow your train of thought. That is made much more difficult if you're not looking at this road ahead or looking at the road right immediately behind you, um, or the path that you've already led the reader down. And so in this course, we'll also be looking at what is this path, the bigger picture. Where should you be leading the reader to? And so you'll have a better notion, I hope, by the end of this course of this road, so that you have an awareness of it and not just focus on the road immediately beneath your feet or your wheels. We're also gonna help train you guys to be your own language detectives. This course, I would love to be with you guys for the rest of your lives and be, your personal consultant, your personal academic writing trainer. But I know that I hope that you won't need me. That's the irony of a teacher is that the teacher hopes that they won't be needed anymore. They want they want to be unemployed by you. Uh, and so what I hope is that by the end of this course, you can autonomously help yourselves through various tools and strategies that we'll be talking about, and one of which is becoming a language detective, how to find solutions to linguistic problems that you'll encounter along your academic writing life. So our objectives here are more to do with, they are language related, but they're more to do with things like uh, how to tell your research story, the tools that you need to get to help yourself in your writing, um, how to be aware of your audience and the importance of that, and what the audience expects, and um, and for you to ultimately have more confidence in your writing. We really hope that by the end of this course, you feel more confident that when you sit down in front of your computer or whatever, uh, you feel like, okay, I think I know what I need to do. Uh, this is a course that is obviously it has a language focus component in it, but I want to move beyond English and think about your development as a writer, uh, as a kind of work in progress, uh, that you're forming your own identity as an academic author, and I hope to make a positive contribution to the formation of this identity. Um, by the end of this course, yes, we want to be able to help you write an academic article or publish, but more broadly, that you'll learn to tell a research story, because at the end of the day, that's what a good academic writer does. A good academic writer is telling uh, a research story, hopefully not telling a whopper, one of those stories about the one that got away, the fisherman's story, but telling a research story, a story that has a particular structure that your readership will be accustomed to, uh, and and tell it in an engaging way. And so the focus of this course is not just uh, about how to do something, particular formula or uh, recipes, but hopefully getting you to feel comfortable as an artisan of your own craft that you will hone for your own particular discipline, and ultimately uh, that you will feel that you have a better chance of acceptance, not just of a particular paper, um, but of your ideas and increasing your chances of having your voice heard. Um, so the outline of the course is basically this. We've covered uh, the introduction to in this module. The next module will be looking at some particular elements of language, including how to solve linguistic problems on your own. In the third module, how to look ahead strategically to your writing, planning it in advance. It's important to think before you write. Module 4 is about what I call orienting the reader, which is already signaling to the reader what the importance is of what you have to say, and and shining a light on what the contribution is of your research. The fifth module is getting down to the nitty-gritty of writing your introduction, the introduction section of your article. Then in the sixth module, we'll be talking more about how to make your writing clearer and make your voice stand out as an author. These are things that are important and often can be criticized by reviewers if they're not done well. Module 7 will look at some important elements that can be key to writing a good method section. Modules 8 and 9 spend a good amount of time on discussing your results and concluding how to do that, because that again, and along with the introduction section, can be a very tricky section for authors. And then the last module is talking something is beyond writing, really. It's about how to deal with publishers, how to deal with responding to reviewers, and other related matters, not developing a text per se, but other matters to do with the academic publishing process. So that's our course in a nutshell. And throughout all this, it is helpful if you have your own data uh, that you've already collected, because this can make things much more concrete for you as you write for this course. Thinking about your own data and how that will drive your article. Uh, by the end of the course, what I hope to have, or hope that you will have, is a kind of template that you will kind of develop along this course. Not a fully fleshed article, but a kind of template of with some parts that are more fleshed out than others, that you'll be able to use later on as a blueprint for future articles that you write. So the idea is that you'll have this template, you'll have gone through a kind of experience of writing in this course, and then later on, when you do finalize an article and you write future articles, you can go back to this experience and remember and help you develop further on. The way you'll be, the way you'll be assessed in this course is through a number of activities and tasks and kind of quizzes that you'll be taking now, and also what I call peer activities. And basically, as I mentioned in this module, I see this as a very important thing, that you go through the process of not looking only at your own writing, but the writing of others. And you see writing more as not just a solitary process, but a social process. Not because I want to be mean and force you to do that for this course, but because I'd like you to have this habit, simply because research shows that this can make, as for example, the Helen Sword research that I cited earlier, can make a positive contribution to your success as a writer, reducing the negative feelings involved, but also helping you in the process of honing your manuscript, improving your writing. And then a big assignment for this course will be actually writing a full introduction section, and I'll talk about this some more in the later modules, but in case you're wondering why the introduction section alone and why that is particularly has such a great weight relative to other sections that we focus on in this course, is that essentially it's your first impression. Uh, it a good introduction section can make or break a manuscript. It's also the section that most EAL, English as an Additional Language authors report as having trouble with. And so if with the time that we have for this class, if I can focus on one particular section and help you improve in that section, it's the introduction section, but it's not the only one. The final article, if you have a full article by the end of the course, that's great. If not, then you'll have probably a patchwork and bits and pieces of an article that you will finally submit as your final assessment for this class, in addition to a kind of reflection that I'll be talking about later. And so that's it for this course. As I said before, um, I'm really, really excited about this course. And I really hope that you find this very useful and helpful, not just now for your immediate purposes, but also long term in the future. Thank you for choosing this course, and I look forward to seeing your writing.